Good evening. Welcome to this 6-week class on comparative religion. Has anyone taken a comparative religion class before? Okay, you know how it's usually structured? 1 week you'll get one religion, the next week you'll get the next religion. Reverend Albert, when we were discussing this, decided to take a little different approach this time because you got to remember a lot from those when you're going to compare, right? You got to remember from last week. So what we decided to do is to take each week a specific religious category and then look at the various religions, how they apply to that category. That gives you a lot better chance to compare right here and now, rather than taking all of this and then having to compare it later. So that's the approach we're going to take, and the religions we're going to cover are Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. Those 5 religions. So we're going to do this over 6 weeks. I'm teaching the odd weeks, not because I'm odd. Well, is that my wife saying, oh yeah? And then Albert will be teaching the even weeks. So these will be the categories. Tonight, beliefs concerning the nature of the absolute, or what some people call God in our tradition. Next week, modes of mediation or connection between the absolute and the phenomenal world. If there is an absolute, how does it communicate with the phenomenal world? Third, creation and what we call eschatological myths. Myths about creation and the end times. Sometimes called the Alpha and the Omega. All religions have their creation myths. They all have their what we call eschatological myths. Good word to remember for a dinner party. And what is your eschatological belief? 4, beliefs related to life after death. 5, values, ethics, and laws. And then 6, significant rituals. So it'll be a 6-week class, and we'll be, like I said, Reverend Albert and I will be alternating. One way of looking at this approach is to see the general categories as the clay and the specific religions as representing individual works of sculpture. Yeah, so there's the clay for the absolute. How does this religion take it and understand it and form it? Always a few words of caution, especially when we're dealing with these broad categories. So, caution about the religious categories. These are human constructs. You got to remember that. They're designed to help us understand reality. They're the maps. But is the map the reality? No. The Google map of Camarillo is not Camarillo. Okay? It's just a map, and there's always that gap. And so it's important to remember that. These are, it's not the actual territory. Regarding the specific religions, here we've got to recognize that and I've talked about this before, within any one religious tradition, large spectrum. Again, if you want example of Christianity, you got Catholicism, you've got all the various Protestant groups, you've got all the fringe groups considered as our Mormons, Christian, so it's a wide range. So when I'm saying Christian, I'm always making some sort of general comment, because I could always refine that, because generally a Catholic view might be different than a Protestant view. So we always have to remember that. That's a wide spectrum. And that's true of Islam, that's true of Hinduism, that's true of Buddhism. That's why I say, really, there is no Christianity. There are Christianities. Now, you might believe that your brand is Christianity, but then if I invited everyone who thought that to a dinner party, it would be a very big party. Okay? And the same is for Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. And also, religions change over time. And they're not constant. They change. If you look at Christianity in the 13th century, compare it today, a lot of big changes. So that's the other thing we have to remember. And we also need to recognize that this is, to me, is very interesting. Some elements of one tradition have more in common with elements of another tradition than they do with their own. For example, certain fundamentalists in Christianity would really have much more in common with fundamentalists in other religions as the way they approach religion compared to more progressive liberal views. So that's another thing to always remember. There's always a spectrum. Now, having said all that, how can I say anything? I can't. Good night. Okay, but we will do our best given those limitations. So let's now get to the task at hand. So tonight I'm going to be dealing with the dimension of religion that contains. Hi, ladies, come on in. That contains beliefs about what we might call the absolute. This aspect of religion is at once the most easy to identify in terms of what various religions claim, and yet sometimes the most difficult to describe. All the great religious traditions claim there exists a dimension of reality that is categorically different from what most people experience as day-to-day normal reality. Okay? There's some aspect of reality that's not right here, right now, somehow can be, but also distinct. One is inclined to say there's a level of reality that transcends the phenomenal world. But even that, you got to be careful with that word, because transcends to some people means out there, and that's not necessarily the case, although for some it is the case. And we'll see in some of these religions, definitely not the case, because sometimes the absolute is immanent as well. Are we getting confused? Good. So if we look back at 19th and 20th century scholars who are looking at this category, they would refer to it sometimes as the supernatural, which is an interesting term if you think about it. What does supernatural mean? Beyond natural. Well, but if it's real, isn't that natural? So but this was a category. If you read the 20th or 19th century, there's the supernatural. And often then the term God or gods will apply to the absolute. But again, we have to be careful because we have to look at the cultural paradigm out of which we're coming. So this notion of the absolute is quite complex if you look at it across the board. People use it, the reason it's easy to say because people say, I believe in this, I believe in that. But if you really try and pin them down, say, well, what does that mean to you? Then it gets a little more difficult. What does it mean to talk about that which cannot be talked about? Quite a challenge. That's why I prefer this term, the ineffable. The ineffable. So when I'm speaking about this dimension, that's the term I like. That means it's beyond linguistic expression or even complete understanding. If something is ineffable, it's beyond our ability to comprehend it totally. And all the religions somewhere along the line will say that about the absolute, even though they have concepts of the absolute. And we'll see this as we go along. So I want to give some examples of how this overall category has been linguistically and symbolically expressed in our different religions. And for convenience, I will use 3 subcategories: monotheism, polytheism, and monism. Now, I would imagine most of you have heard of monotheism, and I'll be talking about that, or polytheism. A lot of people haven't heard about monism, and so I'll get to that shortly. And again, remember, these are just words and symbols meant to express certain common characteristics, and that, again, there's a spectrum. There's a spectrum. So let's start with monotheism. In monotheistic systems, The ineffable is generally seen as being a unitary reality, one, mono, beyond space and time and creation itself. So sometimes two separate circles, which is interesting. It's monotheism, but there's two circles. Because in monotheism, the absolute, the ineffable, is seen to be separate from its creation. It brings about the creation, but it's always separate in its essence. So it's monotheism. You can think of two circles. One circle would be the absolute. The second circle would be the phenomenal world. And the two are brought together through the act of creation. So it's one God, mono, but two circles because the God is not the creation. It's distinct from the creation at some level. Are there exceptions? Yes. Okay. And generally speaking, that absolute is seen to be the cause of the phenomenal world. That's creation, right? Where did the world come from? Certain monotheists say God created the world. So the world is an effect of God's cause. That's most all the monotheistic systems accept that. This act of creation, God is the cause, creation is the effect. And the two circles, I think, give you somewhat of an example. So one scholar has commented in these terms, so maybe this will simplify it. In monotheism, the cause of all is one. The cause of all is one. This does not mean one as in one of a pair, nor one as an object that is made up of many elements, nor as a single simple object that is infinitely divisible. In monotheism, God is a unity unlike any other possible unity. That's what makes it the absolute. And this has been the favored pattern of what we call the three great Semitic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They all share this notion of the absolute. There are varieties within the tradition, but by and large, this is what they share. So, in common parlance, the ineffable in Judaism is referred to as Yahweh. That's on the left. The middle, and I've put God, but that's just the English term. It could be Gott if it was German, or Du if so, but the terms that are generally used. And on the right, it's Allah. And though, especially as far as Judaism, as Yahweh goes, you'll never see a picture of Yahweh. You'll never see a picture of Allah. You may see a picture of God, okay, if you've been to the Sistine Chapel, okay, you'll see, okay, and I'll get to that in a moment, okay. So in the Jewish Torah, that's Genesis, we find, in the beginning, Yahweh created the heavens and the earth. And by the way, the word Yahweh is never even said. It's so sacred, so beyond conception, you can't even use the term. Once a year during Atonement Day, the high priest in the temple could use the term. That was to keep that mystery. Because what happens when you give something a name? You automatically bring it down. You bring it into some idea in your head. If I say God, you might think of God of the Sistine Chapel. Same with Allah. That's why Allah, you never see a picture. The name is mentioned, but it's always just the name. So, and if we look at the opening lines of the early Christian creeds, for example, the Nicene Creed, we find, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Or in Islam, There is the declaration of faith. There is no God but Allah. It's that one unitary absolute. Now, in monotheistic systems, the ineffable is also generally seen as personal, that we call anthropomorphic, in the sense that humans are capable of relating to it on a personal level. You find in most of these traditions the idea of prayer. You're praying to this absolute. So there's a personal relationship here. It's not just some neutral absolute out there. It's believed to have some sort of personal relationship with human beings. It's often characterized by such words as omnipotent, which means all-powerful, omnipresent, always here, and omniscient, all-knowing. Those are the three characteristics that are given to this Semitic absolute. Strong monotheisms characteristically discourage any form of symbolic expression that suggests form. Thou shalt not make a graven or carved image. It's one of the 10 Commandments. Although, interestingly enough, right at the foot of Sinai, there's this beautiful monastery, Greek Orthodox monastery, where all the great icons are found. They're gorgeous, but it's kind of ironic. I mean, those are those are images, if you've ever seen them. I think they had a display at the Getty a few years back. They're just gorgeous, but I find it kind of ironic that it's from a monastery right at the foot of Sinai. No images. Yeah, Chris's dad used to say, Moses went up to the mountain, he was given 10 commandments. He came down and he gave them, then the lawyers got a hold of it. So in any case, but it's very much part of these traditions. You're not supposed to have idols, let's put it that way. Like I said, Jews could not even say the word for God, except on the Day of Atonement and the high priest. Second commandment prohibits graven images. Early Christians did not represent God in images, and thus were a source of amazement to both the Greeks and the Romans. How can your God not have a form? That was a question the Greeks would ask, both the Jews and the Christians, because the Greek gods had form. They had form. And then we find periodically throughout history what we call iconoclastic attacks. You ever heard of the Puritans? What did they do besides? They destroyed images in churches. They went in to these beautiful Catholic cathedrals and destroyed all the images. Why? They were obeying the second commandment. At least they thought they were. And periodically, we get this in Christian history. There'll be this sudden movement towards not having images. Protestantism got rid of a lot of images. You compare going in, unless you're Anglican, high Anglican like I was, and it's very hard to just go into a church. Very similar to Catholic churches, right? Lots of images. You'll find Mary. I don't know if you've noticed down at the High Episcopal Church here, there's a statue of Mary in there. You won't find that in most Protestant churches, because it was this idea that we can't have images. And in Islam, it has been considered blasphemy to have such images. Do you remember the big cartoon controversy that took place a few years back in France? When that, I forget the name of the magazine, was publishing pictures of Muhammad. In not very nice ways, I might add. I think one holding an AK-47. And then people wondered why Muslims were upset at that. It's freedom of speech. I should have the right to display anything I want. Well, that might be true, but what about a bit of wisdom? What about a bit of wisdom? Yeah, so there was a movie years ago made about Muhammad, and it was from the camera. It was as if you were the camera looking out, so you never saw an image of Muhammad. But even that got protests down in Westwood. I remember when they were showing it down there, protests. So it's very important, especially for Muslims. Thus, all three religions identify with the word rather than images. We'll see this will differ quite a bit when we get to Hinduism. Okay? So on the left we have the Torah. In the middle we have the Bible, which part of which is the Torah. And on the right we have the Quran. What is it about the word that makes it more acceptable than a statue? It's abstract. It doesn't have specific form. Although when you think about it, words create form in the mind, but that's okay. So it's the word. All these three religions on their focus on the word. That's why their scriptures become extremely important. Okay. And as monotheistic religions have tended to see the ineffable as interventionist. What does that mean? God doesn't just sit out there. Oops, sorry, Mike. Got to stay in camera. He doesn't just sit out there. He actually becomes involved in the world in some way. Okay? In Christianity, it's through the incarnation. Okay? In Islam, it's through prophets. And Elbert will be talking about this. And he tells you what to do. Or the ineffable tells you what to do. Okay? There is connection here. Okay? There is connection. And sometimes this is even seen as miraculous. There are numerous scriptural relations, therefore, to God's will. So God has a will. God desires things, but the Absolute has a will in these three traditions. And you'll find throughout the theological discussions reference to God's will. Sometimes it gets rather complex. Was that God's will? Or was that not God's will? But you usually don't find in these traditions saying there's no such thing as God's will. So there's this idea that God has a relationship with his creation, especially men. This can range from complete determinism, God's willed everything. We have that in our Christian tradition in Calvinism. There's no free will. Everything has been decided right from the beginning, including your salvation and your damnation. And you shouldn't be opposed to that because who are you? God is omnipotent. God's will be done. And you find that in extreme examples of Islam too. It's God's will. It's God's will. What God is generally seen as good. You notice in the creation Genesis story, after each act of creation, what is it said? And it was good. It was good. So again, common belief, Jews, Christians, Muslims, no question, God is good. That does create some theological problems, especially when it comes to the question of evil. If God is good, whence evil? But we'll get to that. Like I said, generally father-like. But yet then we get to this question of evil. And it has been a major theological issue in all three traditions. Still is. Still is. Because it's the big question, isn't it? If you look at the world and you see all these things, and God is good, how do you bring those together? That becomes a major. And it greatly influenced St. Augustine. And we'll see. And this is an interesting question. This is one you should take home and think about. It was raised, and this was the answer given by this philosopher. If I ask you, is this the best of all possible worlds? If you say yes, well, And if you say no, why isn't it better? This is one of the problems of anthropomorphic theology. It gets you into these kind of binds sometimes. But if you're looking at the history of religious thought, this is a big question. And it's still a big question. And it really became a big question for the Jews after Auschwitz. How do you explain Auschwitz? And there have been different answers, believe it or not. You know what one of the answers is? You were guilty and you deserved it. Because you went away from Torah. That's one extreme. Others have said, well, we can't have an anthropomorphic God anymore. We got to talk about God differently than somebody who punishes. But there's been that big, big spectrum. But it's a big question. It's a big question. Then what about natural evil? We talk about human evil. Is there such a thing as natural evil? A tsunami that kills 20,000 people. We wouldn't generally call that evil. But if somebody went out and killed 5 people, we'd call him or her evil. So these are the big questions that come out of anthropomorphic views of God. Okay, so that's monotheism. I want to stop. Any questions, thoughts, insights? You're probably familiar with this system because generally if you're religious at all, you've been raised with the idea of one God and creation and the various things I said. So then we move to polytheism. It does not portray the ineffable as a single unitary reality. Rather, it is seen as consisting of interconnected realities. In common parlance, there are gods, not God. Okay? You can have the sacred, you can have the absolute, but that absolute isn't just one absolute circle. It has smaller circles within it. I like this sort of definition by the scholar David Griffin. This is how he defined polytheistic systems. And that includes religious, but others, as you'll see. What is polytheism? Polytheism is the name given to a specific religious situation, one that is characterized by plurality. A plurality that manifests itself in many forms. For instance, socially speaking, polytheism is a situation in which there are various values, patterns of social organization, and principles by which man governs his political life. So if you look at comparative cultures, that's poly. There's not just one cultural system around. There are many different ones. And they all claim to be truth, to have truth related to them. That's poly. Philosophically, polytheism is that reality experienced by men and women. Now this is interesting. When truth cannot be articulated according to a single logic. Okay, and we probably come across that quite often, right? When truth doesn't quite fit one single logical system. So maybe there's not truth, maybe there are truths. Although you got to be careful with words. What's wrong with this statement? There is no truth. Is that true? And I use that example because it shows us the limitation of words. Yeah, the limitation. But we're stuck. I mean, we can do things other than words, and we'll talk about that. But we are sort of prisoners of our language. You ever recognize that? In many ways, we're prisoners to the language we grew up with. So, and then it says, religiously, polytheism is a system of symbolizing reality in a plural way in order to account for experience. Okay? Experience tends to be pluralistic, doesn't it? There's just not one thing acting out there. There are all sorts of things going on. So how do you explain a thunderstorm? Well, maybe there's a God for thunderstorm. Okay. So that's what polytheism does. Now, we're going to get a little more complicated because there's hard polytheism and soft polytheism. In hard polytheism, the gods are portrayed as distinct but related beings. And if you want examples, the Greek gods. The Greeks believed their gods were independent deities. Somebody asked me once, did the Greeks believe in their gods? Of course they did. We tend to think, well, those were myths. Okay? But it drove a civilization for a long time. There's a book called Did the Greeks Believe in Their Gods? Yes, of course they did. But what's interesting in this these are independent. Now, some are more powerful than others. Zeus was always more powerful. But the other gods were independent. It was like if you had your king and then you had your governors and they were responsible for their realm. So if as a believer you wanted some aid in a certain area, you'd have to find out which god to pray to. You find an overflow of that in medieval Catholicism and even Catholicism today with all the saints. And if you ever look them up, each saint has their own area that they take care of. Okay. What's the children's hospital here? St. Jude. You know what Jude is? Lost causes. The saint of lost causes. That's the last. When things are. So that's an interesting connection why it has that hospital has its name. It's for those people, those especially kids who are in really bad situations. Yeah. So St. Jude. So that's hard polytheism, and of course you grew up knowing all your Greek gods, right, and goddesses, and they all have, that's why the myths are so wonderful. They're fighting with each other and over. So, but that's hard polytheism. Soft polytheism. Here's examples of Athena. Soft polytheism is found in Hinduism. This is where the various gods or goddesses are seen as manifestations representing different aspects of the one God. They're not completely distinct. If you want to use the body as an analogy, okay, the body's the body, but their hands, their feet, they do different things, but they're all part of the one body. You see the distinction then? Hard polytheism said the gods are distinct. Soft polytheism say they're aspects of something beyond themselves. So for example, most Hindus, let's say they believe in Vishnu as the main god. Well, Vishnu will have consorts. He will have all sorts of other gods and goddesses that come out of him. And that's where you get soft polytheism. So, Sita and Kali. These are two female aspects of the two main gods. You'll often see them in images together as husband and wife. Okay? But the theology teaches they're different. They're the feminine aspect of the one. Okay? It's a big distinction. What is it? What's the difference? Well, it's a big difference. Because ultimately, you get to the notion that God in Hinduism, even though it's popularly practiced as polytheism, its high philosophy is very monotheistic, if not monistic, because everything comes from one. It's just on the popular level. You can worship the different parts of that one. And that's an important... and we even find this a little... Well, did we get Lakshmi and Parvati? Did I skip over them? Okay. And then, there's Ganesh. Ganesh is part of the god Shiva. He's his son. He's his son. Now what's the question? Why does he have an elephant head? Well, that's when you go back to the myths. There are about 36 different stories. You can buy which one you like. But one of the most popular ones is that Shiva and his wife Parvati were having a bit of a quarrel. The gods quarrel. And little Ganesh stood up for his mama. And Shiva, in a fit of anger, cut his head off. Now, we say, how can the gods do that? But do you see, that happens with humans all the time, doesn't it? The anger, etc. So there's this attempt to tie in. But he replaced it with the first head he could find. He said he was sorry, and he found an elephant and put the elephant head on. So what does Ganesh stand for? The twice born. Reincarnation. Good luck. Good luck. If you go to India and young kids are studying for their exams, they're probably going to go down to the temple of Ganesh right before they take their exam, because Ganesh can give you good luck. So, but this is an example of soft polytheism, and you even find it in popular Buddhism, not high theological, philosophical Buddhism, but in popular Buddhism, and it's something called a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva isn't a god or a goddess, but plays the same role if you look at how they're used in various cultures. These are spirit beings that live in different dimensions that can help you. Kuan Yin is a classical example. If you ever, with the bodhisattva of ultimate compassion. Now, at the higher level, you see the Kuan Yin within you, etc. But if you go to villages, you go to the way she's worshipped. People will ask her for help. So, although Buddhists often we say they don't have gods and goddesses, they have somewhat similar things when it comes to practical popular religion. And that's something I should have said right from the beginning. You study any religion. There's the high tradition, which is more the intellectual, philosophical, and then there's the popular tradition as it's practiced by people. Sometimes many people can't read, so there's always those distinctions. Okay, let me just tell you one story before we get to monism about how we relate this idea of one within Hinduism to the many. So there's this story. There's a student and his guru. And the student says, after touching his feet, touching the guru's feet, you always do that. Oh, Guruji, how many gods are there? The guru looks around and says, 1 million. And the student sort of reflects about it. He says, Guruji, how many really? The guru says, 100,000. Come on. How many? And it goes step by step by step. Finally gets to 2. And then he says, 2, Guruji? And Guru said, no, 1. Then the student says, well, what are all those other million? And the Guru says, they're just manifestations of the one. They're just manifestations of the one. Your toes are part of your body. Okay? I like that story. Okay. That's another one. Yeah, Ramakrishna, the great, the great Hindu saint. He said, "How do you like your God? With form or without? We got both." Yeah. Okay. So, just finish up with polytheism here. Gods are portrayed very similar to human beings. Gods have will. They can cause things to happen. You can pray to them. Now, what's interesting, I remember talking about this. Let's say a hurricane comes through and wipes out your town. And you can blame it on the god of hurricanes. Is that such a bad thing? What's the alternative? Chance. Chance. Complete chance. What I'm saying is people sometimes will take a explanation, even though it's painful, over no explanation at all. What we don't like more than anything else is chaos. Whether it's political, social, psychological, religious. When things aren't fitting, when things seem chaotic and you seem completely lost. So if a hurricane comes through and let's say in East Bengal, destroys something, and I go and I say, don't pray to that goddess. She can't help you. And the person says, well, who can? And what's my answer? It's just science. It's just how things are. And you can say that to people, but sometimes it's comforting. Which, again, this raises an interesting question. Is truth always the best answer? Is truth always the best answer? If I see someone and I think, oh, look at that hairdo. Do I go up and say, I got to be truthful? No, it's an interesting. We tend to think truth is the highest value, and it's a very high value, but what if it's in conflict with other values? What if it's in conflict with compassion? So these the polytheistic system allows for this play with these things. You can have a God who's compassionate. You can have a God who's angry. Because you can relate to those personally. I think that's why on the popular level, it's always existed. Even if you look at Christianity, how it was practiced by the common folk, you had saints. You didn't just have the Trinity. You had all these active saints working at different levels. So in any case, I'm trying to get a little good word in for polytheism. Because generally if people say polytheism, you must be, anyway, okay. So let's move to our final category, which is monism. Okay. What do you notice about the circle there? There's only one circle, but there's not another one for creation. There's one circle with the center being dark. Okay? So monism depicts the ineffable, not as a completely separate reality from creation, but something that permeates all of creation. It's immanent and transcendent. So if the white circle is the world, the black circle is within it. You notice that? It permeates, it's part of it. It isn't something out there. It's part of the entire creation. It's almost like the absolute is embedded in phenomena. It's embedded, it's not out there. Here the notion is all is one. There is no division. And the reason we see things as divided is because we live in illusion. We live based on our sense perceptions and our minds, both of which are extremely limited. Have you ever seen a mirage? Is it real? Your senses told you it was. Yeah. You ever thought something is a unicorn real? You can have an idea of it. So in other words, that's the monism, it's all one. But we see it as many because we're in a state of delusion to some extent. So in common terminology, God, if we want to use that term, and the universe are one. Not separate things. The way I like to think about it is, again, that it's permeating. All phenomena is permeated by this absolute. Not separate, not totally. It's kind of interesting, right? If something permeates you and permeates all of us, that means there's a unity there, but it's not just in me, it's in everything. That's the idea in monism. We have some interesting examples from ancient Greek philosophy. Did anyone ever study any Greek philosophy? This gentleman by the name of Parmenides, very influential. He claimed there's no division in anything. Everything is one. And why do we see it as different? Because our senses are wrong. He said, I can prove this through reason. What's the smallest point between my two hands? I could get to the smallest point, but what could I always do but with my mind? Okay, let me put it this way. What's the smallest number? What's the largest number? There's no smallest number. There's no largest number. Are there more odd numbers or even numbers? He's using these to show that if you really think about it, there can't be separation. How you can divide something over and over and over again. Good example, his student gave the example. This is what you want to see. Achilles and the tortoise in a race. Okay? Here are the ground rules. Who's going to win this race? Who do you think is going to win this race? Achilles, right? Here are the ground rules. The tortoise gets a head start. Well, that's fair. The greatest warrior athlete in ancient Greece against the tortoise. Come on. He gets a head start. And the rules are that every unit of time, whatever we take, Achilles will cut the lead in half. So he's going faster, but he'll never catch him. Because you can always divide something in half. So they would use this sort of argument to show that the only way that we can even move, if we think about it, is that there can't be any division here. There's not just a series of infinite points. Otherwise, I'd never be able to get from here to dawn. I'd have to cross infinity. So they were arguing there's no division. Reality isn't divided up. And that's monistic. That's what we get to as monistic. We find this in the Jewish Kabbalah, the Jewish mystical texts. It's known as Ein Sof. They call it Ein Sof. That's the oneness of all being and all reality. Not a Yahweh that's distinct outside. Ein Sof. Everything. Everything. Anyone ever heard of this gentleman? Meister Eckhart, the great 13th century Christian mystic. 1260 to 1328. He spoke of a God beyond God. What did he mean by that? It means that the common monotheistic notions of God are not God. That there was a God beyond God. A God beyond our linguistic God. And that's the all-encompassing one. The divine essence which cannot be divided in any way. In Islam, we have the great mystic Ibn al-Arabi. He had his what called the doctrine of divine unity, Wahad al-Wujud. Pure isness. He called it pure isness. No separation. And all the worldly phenomenal distinctions are only apparent facets of the one seamless God. We find this very strongly in Hinduism, in high intellectual, if you want to call it, Hinduism, called the Vedanta, which goes back to a series of, they are now books, but they were originally just oral transmissions of great gurus called the Upanishads. Upanishad means to sit at the foot of. So the students would go in the forest with their guru and sit and listen to him. And these are texts that are very monistic. The term they use for the ineffable is Brahman. Brahman. B-R-A-H-M. Not to be confused with Brahman, the caste. Brahman. The fundamental essence of all things associated with pure consciousness, pure presence. This is the way one scholar by the name of Hans Thorstuen described it. This supreme cosmic spirit, or absolute reality, called Brahman, is eternal, genderless, ultimately indescribable in human language. It can best be described as infinite being, infinite consciousness, and infinite bliss. Brahman is regarded as the source and essence of the entire universe. The universe is not just conscious, it is consciousness. Okay? And this consciousness is Brahman. And high Vedantic thought then goes on to say that that is within you. It's called your Atman. Tat Tvam Asi. You are that one. You are not separate. You think you are. Our minds and our senses tell us we are. But this says no. There's no division in reality. Everything is ultimately one. It takes a little work to get there to realize it. Yeah. But that's the notion. Tat Tvam Asi. This is a little story from one of the Upanishads, and I'll read it to you, and we're almost done. In the beginning was only being, Brahman, one without a second. Out of himself he brought forth the cosmos and entered into everything in it. That's the difference. He brings forth the cosmos, but he's part of it. We say he sleeps, but he sleeps in the self. As a tethered bird grows tired of flying about in vain to find a place of rest and settles down at last on its perch. So the mind, tired of wandering about hither and thither, settles down at last into its ultimate self. As bees suck nectar from many a flower and make their honey one, so that no drop can say, I am from this flower or that, all creatures, though one, know not that they are one. That's the problem. We don't know it, and so we don't act on it. And then he says, as rivers flowing east and west emerge in the sea and become one, everything is Brahman. And then he says to his student, and you too are Brahman. Now, whether you believe that or not, just imagine what it'd be like if that's what we thought. If that's how we looked at the world. If that's how we looked at things. That when I look at anyone, I see you as part of me. Not distinct. Maybe distinct in form, but in essence, we're all one. Would we act differently? You think so? You think so? I kind of think so. And the great proponent of this was Adi Shankara. He was the 8th century Vedantic sage. Okay, let me just finish up with Buddhism. Monistic Buddhism, as I'm using it, the ineffable is often referred to as nirvana or shunyata. Nirvana or shunyata. Technically, nirvana, if you look at what it actually literally means, it's a blowing out. Like when you blow out a candle. And shunyata is usually translated as emptiness. Emptiness. The ineffable is emptiness in the sense that is nothing, no thing. You know, when we think at the word nothing, we often think of a void. But if you just break it down, it's no thing. Okay? Shunyata is no thing. This emptiness, however, allows for the existence of all things. If there was no emptiness, you'd have nothing. Let me give you an example. Would you have a cup if you didn't have the inner emptiness of the cup? No. You need the emptiness to have the cup. Okay? So it's this notion that underneath all the things and objects, there is an emptiness. No thing. But everything is dependent on it. Isn't that strange? Everything is dependent on nothing. Now, nothing is that difficult. Basically, it should be everything is dependent on emptiness. Because emptiness doesn't mean nothing. Yeah. And that was pointed out by this great sage of the 3rd century, Nagarjuna. One of my favorites. Asserted that all things are dependent on other things, and therefore empty of individual essence. Everything is dependent on everything else. Therefore, nothing is completely independent. It's called dependent arising. We're all connected. And what connects us, interestingly, is the shunyata, the nirvana, the nothingness, no thingness. And that's why, one of the goals in meditation is to quiet that mind, which is going to continually tell you there's things. Not only things out there, but lots of things in here, right? Thing. Shut it down and experience the emptiness. And when you can, it's said to be extremely blissful. Extremely blissful. It removes you from all that monkey mind, all that worry, all that anxiety. Can I make that 5-foot putt? And I missed it today. So this is what I see in Buddhism, although you don't talk about gods so much, but there is this notion of an absolute emptiness on which everything else is dependent. And that works so much against our common sense, because we always think in terms of objects, names, things. Okay. And like I said, the important thing, he was saying that emptiness does not mean nothing. And then he warned, and this is taking, do not use the concept emptiness as absolute. Because then you've actually violated the principle. Okay? Even emptiness isn't absolute. Even emptiness is empty. Which gets, I know mine's going, but, okay. So that sort of brings us to the end of this first session. Next week, Reverend Albert will be talking about prophets, incarnations, avatars, the connection that religions see between this absolute aspect of reality that we've been focusing on and the phenomenal reality of the world. How are they connected? Different religions say different things. So he'll be looking at that. So any comments at the moment? Do take some of those ideas home and don't think about them. Just be silent and see what pops up. So any questions, thoughts? Good, okay. Next week, Albert will take over, and see you then.